Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're stepping right onto the sands of a South Australian beach back in 1948 to unpack one of the most baffling, mind-bending cold cases in modern history. We're talking about the Somerton Man. For over 70 years, the discovery of a completely unidentified body on that beach has fueled this massive global investigation. We've got secret codes, we've got untraceable poisons, and we've got totally erased identities.
But before we get into all the crazy evidence, I want you to just consider this quote for a second. If he wasn't lying here in 1948, we would never have met. Now that might sound like a dramatic line from a detective novel, right? But it's actually a real quote from a woman whose entire life was shaped by this dead man. It teases this incredible reality that a creepy, decades-old cold case somehow resulted in a modern-day love story and a brand new family. How in the world does that happen? Well, stick with me, because that is exactly what we're going to unravel.
Okay, let's dive right into part one, the body on the beach. To understand how this all ends, we absolutely have to start at the beginning, on a cool December morning at Somerton Beach.
Let's walk through the exact sequence of events here. Picture this. It's the evening of November 30th. A local guy named John Lyons is out taking a stroll with his wife, and they spot a man just kind of leaning back against the seawall. His legs are stretched out, feet are crossed. They figure, he's just a drunk sleeping it off. No big deal. But fast forward to dawn the next morning. Two trainee jockeys are out exercising their horses on the beach. One of them, Hoary Patching, notices that the guy from last night hasn't moved an inch. So he hops off his horse, grabs the man's leg, and makes a horrifying realization. The guy's completely stiff. He's dead. Now, the sheer normalcy of the scene is what makes it so incredibly chilling. The man looked perfectly peaceful. It looked like he was just taking a nap. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood anywhere, and the sand around him was completely undisturbed. He literally had a half-smoked cigarette resting gently on his open shirt collar. But here's the kicker. That tranquil image completely contradicted what the medical examiner found during the autopsy. The victim's stomach was deeply congested with blood. The official cause of death? Heart failure brought on by an unidentifiable poison. A poison that was either so rare or so incredibly fast-acting that it left virtually zero chemical trace behind. So the police have a poisoned man on a public beach? Usually, what's the protocol? You check the pockets, find the wallet, call the family. But as we move into part two, the baffling clues, you'll see that the evidence left behind only made things so much worse. Think about the stuff you have in your pockets right now. It says something about you, right? Well, what's truly bizarre about the Somerton Man is the incredibly pristine condition of the body, juxtaposed with his pocket litter. This was a guy who clearly took extreme care of his appearance. The pathologist specifically noted that his toenails and fingernails were unusually clean, and his shoes looked freshly polished. Yet every single manufacturer's label had been meticulously cut or ripped out of his clothing. He had no wallet, absolutely no ID, just incredibly mundane items: an open pack of cigarettes, matches, juicy fruit gum, 2 combs, a bus ticket, and an unused railway ticket to Henley Beach. Nothing to identify him. He was essentially a ghost. And then, months later, police are doing another sweep of his clothing, and they make this dramatic, morbid discovery. Rolled up super tight, hidden deep inside a tiny fob pocket in his trousers, was a printed scrap of paper. 2 words on it: Tamam Shud. It's a Persian phrase, and it translates to the end or the finish. And it wasn't just handwritten, it had been physically torn from a really rare edition of a poetry book called the Rubáiyát of Omar Khayyám. It was almost like this guy was deliberately announcing his own final curtain call. Now, to truly grasp why the Somerton Man blew up the way he did, we have to zoom out a bit. That brings us to part 3, a nation of missing men, because this wasn't just a puzzle anymore. It became a symbol for a society that was deeply traumatized. Historian Dr. Ruth Bolland has done some fascinating research on this, highlighting how the Somerton Man's unknowableness basically acted as a blank canvas. You have to remember what the world looked like in 1948. People are reeling from World War II. You've got thousands of displaced persons arriving on boats from Europe, many of whom had completely lost or maybe even deliberately shed their old identities. Plus, countless young men simply never came home from the war at all. So, for a grieving, unsettled Australian public, this anonymous body on the beach essentially became everyone's missing person. The police stations were just flooded with these desperate, heartbreaking letters from everyday citizens. One woman from Victoria wrote in, absolutely convinced that the body was her husband, a returned soldier she described as having a very restless and moody disposition. Another woman, who had been searching for her husband who vanished 18 years prior, wrote asking if the man had sleepy gray eyes. Fathers were looking for sons, brothers looking for brothers. The Somerton Man absorbed all of this raw, post-war suburban grief. Over time, the massive public fascination really split into two main camps. On one hand, you've got the Cold War spy theory. The meticulous removal of clothing labels and undetectable poison, secret codes later on, it literally screams covert operative. But on the other hand, there's the displaced refugee theory. Was he just a European migrant trying to navigate the chaotic aftermath of World War II? A man who lost his identity in the endless bureaucratic shuffle of refugee camps, arriving alone and ultimately ending his life on a straying shore? Despite all the wild public speculation, the cops were hitting a massive brick wall. So the crucial turning point comes when a single piece of physical evidence blows the investigation wide open. Let's look at part 4, the nurse and the code. So, remember that scrap of paper? Well, after the police publicized the phrase Tamam Shud, a local man actually came forward. He handed in a copy of the Rubáiyát that he said had been tossed right into the back seat of his parked car about 6 months earlier. Sure enough, the last page, the one with Tamam Shud, was torn out. But the real goldmine was on the back cover of the book. Investigators found a series of strange, faint, penciled letters. It was a code that to this day no one has fully cracked. And right below that code, an unlisted phone number. The police obviously trace it, and it belongs to a 27-year-old nurse named Jo Thompson. And guess where she lived? Just a 5-minute walk from where the body was found. So the police go to pay this young nurse a visit, but she is incredibly evasive. She's given them nothing. So, trying to force a definitive identification, they actually bring her in to look at a plaster death mask of the Somerton Man, which a taxidermist had created to preserve his face. Her reaction was explosive. According to the taxidermist who was standing right there, Jodie Thompson took one look at that plaster bust, stared straight down at the floor, and nearly fainted. The physical shock was absolutely undeniable. Yet, when the detective asked her point blank if she knew him, she flatly said no. She denied the whole thing. But the investigators walked out of there completely convinced she was terrified of a ghost from her past. And honestly, that is where the trail went completely cold for decades. Until we hit part 5, the modern DNA twist. This is where modern science meets history. Enter Professor Derek Abbott. He's an electronic engineering professor who became absolutely unapologetically obsessed with applying practical math and science to finally crack this cold case. Professor Abbott goes to work, systematically hunting down the genealogy step by step. Step 1. He officially identifies the secretive nurse from the files as Jo Thompson. Step 2. He discovers she had a son named Robin, who surprisingly grew up to be a professional ballet dancer. Now, tragically, Robin had already passed away. So, step 3, Abbott tracks down Robin's biological daughter, Rachel Egan, who had actually been adopted out to a family in New Zealand. Step 4 is where this story becomes completely wild. Abbott travels to New Zealand, sits down with Rachel, explains this incredibly complex theory that she might be the biological granddaughter of the Somerton Man, asks her for a DNA swab, and then, very shortly after, asks her for her hand in marriage. Now, you're probably wondering why in the world was Abbott so confident about this family connection even before running the DNA test? Well, this brilliantly illustrates the scientific detective work he was doing. Abbott compared autopsy photos of the Somerton Man with photos of Jo Thompson's son, Robin, and he found they shared a couple of incredibly rare, specific genetic traits. First, both men were completely missing their lateral incisor teeth. Second, both had earlobes entirely attached to the side of their face. Abbott literally ran the math and calculated that the statistical probability of two random individuals sharing this exact combination of anomalies is only about 1 in 10,000. Add that to the fact that the original 1948 autopsy specifically noted the Somerton Man had unusually highly developed calf muscles, just like a professional ballet dancer, and the physical connection is just staggering. Rachel Egan, who, by the way, did say yes and married Professor Abbott, I think she described the situation best. She said, "It's almost like we have a double love story happening, with two plots that have become intertwined over a long period of time. It really is a surreal juxtaposition. Think about it. You have this potential tragic 1948 romance between the Somerton Man and the secretive nurse Jo Thompson, a romance that ultimately ends with a lonely death on a beach. And perfectly mirroring it, decades later, you have the successful modern romance between the investigator Derek Abbott and the Somerton Man's potential granddaughter Rachel, ending in a beautiful family with 3 kids. But, of course, the ultimate truth required more than just statistical probabilities. It required hard science. Finally, after 70 years of waiting, the South Australian Attorney General officially granted approval for the exhumation of the Somerton Man's embalmed remains. The goal? To extract viable DNA from his bones or teeth and definitively answer the questions of his lineage and his true identity once and for all. Which leaves us with a really profound final thought to take away from this explainer today. If this exhumation and DNA testing finally gives the Somerton Man his name back, what does that actually mean? Does solving this ultimate 70-year-old mystery finally heal a family's fragmented history, providing some closure to those left behind? Or, as the secrets of a reluctant nurse and an unknown, poisoned man are dragged out into the modern light, are some ghosts better left resting peacefully on the beach? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive. Let that question linger until next time.